The ballroom lights caught the edge of the velvet rope just as Ryder Donovan stepped past it. His boots, the good ones, the only ones without a hole starting at the toe, sinking slightly into carpet so thick it's sound. And for a moment he stood frozen at the threshold between two entirely different worlds. One he had spent 4 years defending on the other side of the planet, and one that had never once thought to thank him for it. Victoria Sinclair stood at the center of the room in a dress the color of poured champagne, a microphone in one hand and a crystal flute in the other. Mid-sentence to a crowd of donors, who had each paid $25,000 to be there, and when her eyes landed on the man in the worn canvas jacket standing awkwardly near the dessert table, something in her sharpened, the way a predator's gaze sharpens on movement at the edge of a clearing. She lowered the microphone an inch, tilted her head, and asked the room, loud enough for everyone to hear, whether anyone believed a man like that day could survive 30 seconds against the best fighter money could buy. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Ryder didn't laugh. He didn't flinch either. He simply looked at the man beside her, 6'4", shoulders like poured concrete, a face that had clearly stopped more punches than it had taken, and something passed behind Ryder's eyes that no one in that room, except one person, recognized for what it was. Victoria raised the flute higher and announced, with the practiced showmanship of someone who had built an empire on spectacle, that she would pay $1 million to any man who could take a single punch from her bodyguard, Dominic Reyes, and remain standing. The room erupted into applause, phones rising like a field of small silver moons. Ryder set down the water glass he'd been holding, carefully, deliberately, as though it mattered, and that was the moment Dominic Reyes, standing 3 feet from the woman who paid his salary, felt every hair on his arms rise at once, because he had seen that same careful, deliberate calm only once before, in a collapsing building 11 years ago, on the other side of the world, from a man who had carried him 400 yards on a shattered leg. To find out who Ryder Donovan really was, and why the very man hired to hurt him would beg his employer to stop the fight before it started, stay until the very end. 11 months earlier, none of this existed. There was no ballroom, no velvet rope, no offer of $1 million. There was only a 2-bedroom apartment on the edge of town where Ryder Donovan worked double shifts as a maintenance technician for a mid-sized property company, and where his 6-year-old son Noah slept in a bed pushed against the radiator, because the room ran cold in winter, and Ryder hadn't yet saved enough to fix the insulation. Ryder had left the Marine Corps 6 years earlier, an infantry squad leader who'd earned a reputation among the men he served with for a kind of stillness under fire that couldn't be taught, only survived into. He didn't talk about the deployments. He didn't talk about the commendations folded into a drawer beneath his son's outgrown clothes, waiting for a day Noah was old enough to ask real questions. What he talked about, when he talked at all, was Noah's laugh, Noah's stubborn refusal to eat vegetables that touched other food, Noah's growing habit of falling asleep mid-sentence during their nightly reading. What Ryder didn't talk about, because he had trained himself not to, was the tremor that had started in Noah's left hand 4 months earlier. Small enough that a stranger wouldn't notice, large enough that a father who watched his son eat breakfast every morning noticed immediately. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday. A rare neurological condition, treatable but not curable, requiring a specialized intervention available at exactly one research hospital on the opposite coast, at a cost that made the woman delivering the news pause and soften her voice before she said the number out loud. $420,000, and that was before travel, before the follow-up care, before the 6 months Ryder would need to take mostly unpaid leave to be at his son's side. Ryder had $11,000 in savings and a maintenance job that paid $19 an hour. He did not cry in front of the doctor. He did not cry in front of Noah. He went home, put his son to bed, and sat alone at the kitchen table with a legal pad, doing math that refused to work no matter how many times he ran it. Victoria Sinclair, 400 miles away, was doing a different kind of math. Sinclair Dynamics, the biomedical technology firm she had built from a garage prototype into a $9 billion company, was 11 days from finalizing the largest licensing deal in its history, an agreement with a European conglomerate worth $800 million, contingent on a single gala fundraiser going flawlessly, because the conglomerate's board chairman, a notoriously image-conscious man named Julian Ashford, would be in attendance personally evaluating whether Sinclair Dynamics carried itself with the polish his shareholders expected. Victoria had not slept more than 5 hours a night in 3 weeks. She had a publicity team engineering every detail of the event down to the exact temperature of the champagne, and she had, at the center of it, a stunt her marketing director had pitched as unforgettable. An open challenge to the crowd. A test of toughness against her personal bodyguard. A spectacle designed to trend online and paint Sinclair Dynamics as bold, fearless, unbeatable. Victoria had approved it without a second thought. She had not, in that moment, imagined a single father in a worn canvas jacket walking through the door because a caterer he knew from a previous job had mentioned, in passing, that the event was short-staffed and paid cash for anyone willing to help load and unload for the night. Cash Ryder desperately needed. And a room he never expected to be pulled into as anything other than invisible help near the kitchen doors. Ryder had not come to the gala to be seen. He had come to carry crates of glassware from a delivery van to the kitchen, to be paid $200 in cash by midnight, and to be home before Noah woke for his medication at 6. He had drifted toward the dessert table, only because the catering manager had sent him to retrieve a serving tray. And it was there, in the wrong place at the wrong time, that Victoria Sinclair's eyes found him and decided, in the careless way powerful people sometimes decide things about those they've never spoken to, that he would make good theater. She hadn't asked his name. She hadn't asked why a man in work clothes was standing near her stage. She had simply pointed the room's attention at him and turned a stranger's private exhaustion into a punchline. Because in that moment, with Julian Ashford watching from a reserved table near the front and $800 million hanging in the balance, Ryder Donovan was not a person to her. He was a prop. Dominic Reyes did not want to hit him. He said so, quietly, leaning down to Victoria's ear as the crowd's applause still rang off the chandeliers, telling her this wasn't a good idea, that something about the man's stance, the way he'd set the glass down, the stillness in his shoulders, wasn't the stillness of a man who didn't understand what was being offered. It was the stillness of a man who understood exactly what was being offered, and had already decided how it would end. Victoria waved him off. She had a room to win and a board chairman to impress. And she told Dominic, not unkindly but not gently either, that this was exactly the kind of moment the night needed. A nobody proving he had heart, a viral clip by morning. She did not know that Dominic's hands had gone cold inside his suit jacket. She did not know that 11 years earlier, in a compound outside a city whose name she would not have recognized, a 26-year-old Marine sergeant named Ryder Donovan had pulled a wounded contractor named Dominic Reyes out from beneath a collapsed support beam, had carried him on a leg later found to have 3 hairline fractures, had refused evacuation for himself until Dominic was stable, and had never once, in the years since, tried to find him or ask anything in return. Dominic had spent a decade looking quietly for the man who saved his life and had never found him, because Ryder Donovan had left the service, changed nothing about his name, and simply become invisible in the way that men who don't want to be thanked often do. The fight, when it happened fast, and it happened wrong. Ryder stepped forward when Victoria asked, not because he wanted the spectacle, but because $1 million was Noah's treatment paid for in full, with money left over, and some risks a father takes without blinking. Dominic, caught between the woman who signed his paycheck and the man who had once carried him 400 yards through gunfire, threw a punch he pulled at the last half-second, a fraction of his real force, and Ryder, trained, composed, reading the room the way he'd once read hostile terrain, rolled his shoulder into the blow instead of bracing against it, absorbing what Dominic hadn't fully thrown, and remained standing. The crowd gasped, then cheered, then surged toward their phones. Victoria smiled the smile of someone who had gotten exactly the content she wanted. And it was in that exact moment, with camera flashes strobing across the room, that Dominic Reyes stepped between Victoria and the cameras, his voice low and urgent, and said the words that would unravel everything she thought she understood about the night. "That's him, Victoria. That's the man who saved my life. Cancel this. Cancel all of this. You have no idea who you're standing next to." Victoria did not understand at first. She thought Dominic meant it figuratively, some soldier's code sentiment about respecting an opponent. It was only when Dominic gripped her arm, his composure, the composure of a man who had never once broken character in 6 years of employment, visibly cracking, that she realized he meant it literally, and that whatever fear was moving through him wasn't outright Ryder Donovan's fists. It was about who Ryder Donovan actually was, and what it meant that she had just turned him into a punchline in front of 800 people, and a board chairman deciding whether her company deserved trust. She looked past Dominic to where Ryder stood at the edge of the stage lights, rubbing his shoulder, saying nothing, already turning to walk back toward the kitchen and the crates he still needed to unload before midnight, and something in his retreat, no anger, no demand for the money, no interest in the cameras still flashing around him, hit Victoria harder than any punch could have. She had humiliated a stranger for spectacle, and the stranger hadn't even stayed to collect his win. Security quietly escorted Ryder out a side entrance 20 minutes later, at Victoria's own flustered instruction, before she'd had the chance to say a single word to him. And it would be 6 weeks before that mistake finally worked its way back to her. In a way she never saw coming, Victoria Sinclair did not sleep well after the gala. The $800 million deal closed within the week. Julian Ashford, it turned out, had found the toughness stunt exactly as compelling as her marketing director predicted, and the headlines the next morning called it a triumph, a bold statement of Sinclair Dynamics' fearless culture. Victoria should have felt victorious. Instead, she found herself replaying, at 3 a.m, the particular way the man in the canvas jacket had set down his water glass, carefully, like it belonged to someone else and he didn't want to break it. She found herself thinking about Dominic's face, gray, with something that looked almost like grief, gripping her arm and begging her to stop a fight she'd already set into motion. She had tried, twice, to ask Dominic directly what he'd meant, and both times he had gone quiet in a way she'd never seen from him, saying only that it wasn't his story to tell, that she needed to hear it from Ryder himself, if Ryder was even willing to talk to her again after what she'd done. It was her assistant, a sharp, quietly observant young woman named Priya Anand, who finally found him. Priya had been troubled by the footage from the night, not the fight itself, but the 90 seconds before it, the way the crowd's laughter looked, replayed slowly, less like fun and more like cruelty, and the way a man who had clearly needed that money badly had walked away without collecting it. She pulled the catering agency's contractor logs, cross-referenced names, and found Ryder Donovan's information within 2 days, including, buried in a public records search she almost didn't run, his separation papers from the Marine Corps, a Bronze Star with Valor device, and a citation for actions taken during an overseas contractor rescue operation 11 years earlier, an operation that named, in careful bureaucratic language, an unnamed wounded civilian contractor whose life he had saved. Priya printed it, sat with it for a long moment, and then walked it into Victoria's office without a word, setting it on the desk in front of her employer like a verdict. Victoria read it twice. Then she asked Priya to find out everything else, not to expose him, not for a headline, but because she needed, urgently, and for reasons she couldn't fully name even to herself, to understand who she had turned into a spectacle. What Priya found over the following days quietly rearranged something in Victoria's chest. A 6-year-old son named Noah, a rare neurological condition, a treatment protocol at a research hospital across the country, a total cost that Ryder Donovan had been trying and failing to save toward on a maintenance technician's wage, working 2 jobs most weeks, never once telling his employer, his neighbors, or the caterer who'd hired him for the night the real reason he needed the cash so badly. He had walked into that ballroom not for glory, not for a stunt, but because he was out of options and a stranger's careless offer of $1 million had, for one desperate evening, looked like a lifeline worth the risk of getting hit by a professional fighter twice his size. Victoria went to find him herself. She did not send Priya, did not send a lawyer, did not send a check by courier the way her instinct told her to, because some part of her understood that money alone would only compound the insult. She drove, alone, to the address Priya had found and stood on the cracked concrete walkway of a modest apartment building for a full minute before she worked up the nerve to knock. When Ryder opened the door, he looked at her with no hostility and no surprise, only a tired, careful neutrality, as if he'd expected this might happen eventually, and had decided in advance not to make it easy or hard for her, just to let it happen. Victoria, for the first time in longer than she could remember, did not know what to say. She had prepared an apology, a formal one, polished the way she polished every public statement, and standing in front of him it evaporated completely, replaced by something plainer and truer. She told him she was sorry, that she had looked at him and seen nothing but his clothes, and that she understood now that had been the worst kind of blindness a person in her position could afford. Ryder listened without interrupting. When she finished, he told her quietly that he didn't want an apology and he didn't want pity. He wanted the $1 million she'd offered in front of 800 witnesses, because his son needed it, and beyond that, he wanted nothing else from her at all. Victoria agreed instantly, reaching for her phone to arrange the transfer that same night. But as she turned to leave, something in Ryder's stillness, the same stillness Dominic had recognized from a battlefield a decade earlier, told her this wasn't over, and that the truth of what happened at that gala, and what it said about her company, was about to reach far more people than the 800 who'd been in that ballroom. 3 days later, a video Priya hadn't authorized, filmed by a guest's phone and slowed down frame by frame with commentary, would surface online with 11 million views and a single caption that would put Victoria Sinclair's name and her judgment on trial in front of the entire country. The video spread faster than anything Sinclair Dynamics' publicity team had ever engineered on purpose, and this time no one was steering it. It wasn't the punch that people fixated on. It was the 90 seconds before, the crowd's laughter, Victoria's dismissive smile, the way Ryder had quietly set down his water glass like a man bracing for something he'd long since made peace with. Commentators dissected his composure frame by frame. Veterans organizations picked up the story once his service record surfaced online, not from Priya's files, but from a fellow Marine who recognized him in the footage and posted his own account of Ryder's reputation in uniform. A man who never sought credit, who'd once given up a promotion so a struggling squadmate could take it instead. Within 4 days, journalists were camped outside Sinclair Dynamics headquarters, no longer asking about the licensing deal, but asking Victoria, directly and repeatedly, why she had turned a decorated veteran and single father into a publicity stunt without bothering to learn his name first. Victoria did not hide from it. This was, Priya would later say, the moment she watched her employer change, not performing contrition for cameras, but sitting with it, canceling a week of scheduled interviews to instead spend 3 full days at the research hospital, where Noah's treatment team was based, quietly covering not just the $1 million already promised, but the full scope of Noah's ongoing care, arranged through the hospital's billing office rather than through any press release, specifically so it wouldn't read as a stunt. She learned, sitting in hospital waiting rooms she had no obligation to be in, the exact protocol Noah needed, a staged neurostimulation therapy requiring 4 separate procedures 6 weeks apart, each one demanding Ryder be present and unable to work. A fact Victoria addressed without being asked by quietly arranging, through her company's foundation, a stipend to cover Ryder's lost wages during the entire treatment window, structured carefully so it could never be mistaken for charity extended to a man who needed rescuing, but as basic decency owed to a man she had wronged. Noah's team explained the treatment in plain terms during those early hospital days. A staged neurostimulation protocol, 4 sessions spaced 6 weeks apart, each requiring careful post-procedure monitoring and a father present at every bedside check. Ryder learned the schedule the way he'd once learned terrain, memorizing it completely, missing nothing, arriving early to every appointment with a small backpack of Noah's favorite things, a worn dinosaur toy, a juice box, a folded blanket that smelled like their apartment. Victoria noticed these details the way she noticed very little else in her life anymore, and it unsettled her how much she wanted to be useful in that unglamorous, unphotographed way, not writing checks from a distance, but sitting on a plastic chair in a hospital hallway at 7 in the morning, holding 2 coffees, one of which she'd learned, without being told twice, that Ryder took black. Dominic Reyes, for his part, could not stay away either. He came to the hospital on his own time, off the clock, and it was there, in a quiet corridor outside Noah's recovery room, that he finally told Ryder the rest of what had been building in him since the gala. That he had spent 10 years trying to track down the sergeant who carried him out of a collapsing compound, that he had given up looking 2 years earlier, certain the man had either changed his name or wanted, for his own reasons, to stay found by no one, and that seeing him standing near a dessert table in a worn jacket, calm as still water while a room full of wealthy strangers laughed at him, had nearly stopped Dominic's heart in his chest. Ryder, listening, did what he always did, said little, let the moment sit, and eventually told Dominic the only thing he'd wanted from that night at the compound 11 years earlier, that Dominic had lived. That was payment enough. It always had been. The unraveling, when it came publicly, and it came at a moment Victoria chose deliberately. Julian Ashford, whose $800 million deal now sat uncomfortably close to a public relations disaster his own board was nervously monitoring, requested a meeting to discuss whether Sinclair Dynamics' culture problem, as the financial press had started calling it, put the partnership at risk. Victoria agreed to the meeting on one condition, that it be held publicly, streamed to shareholders, with full transparency about what had actually happened and what she intended to do about it. She stood in front of that same board chairman, in front of cameras far more consequential than the ones at the gala, and did not spin the story. She named exactly what she'd done wrong, described Ryder Donovan's actual history in full, his service record, his son, the desperate math of a father trying to save a life on $19 an hour, and said, plainly, that a company that couldn't recognize the worth of a man like that, standing right in front of it, had no business claiming boldness as a value at all. Ashford, watching, said nothing for a long moment, and then asked the one question no one in the room expected, whether Mr. Donovan might be willing to meet with him personally. Victoria, watching the deal she'd spent months protecting suddenly hinge on Ryder's willingness to forgive a stranger, realized with a jolt that the outcome of everything, the contract, her company's reputation, and something else she was only beginning to name to herself, no longer rested in her hands at all. It rested with a quiet man in a maintenance uniform who owed the room nothing, and everyone would find out, 6 weeks later, exactly what he chose to do with that power. Priya, watching from the back of the room as the stream cut to black, found herself thinking that whatever Ryder Donovan decided in that meeting would say more about the true character of Sinclair Dynamics than any earnings call or press release ever had, and that Victoria, for the first time since Priya had come to work for her, seemed genuinely afraid of an answer she could not control. 6 weeks later, in a conference room at Sinclair Dynamics headquarters. Not a ballroom, not a stage. No cameras beyond a single company photographer Victoria had insisted stay in the corner and out of the way. Julian Ashford sat across a table from Ryder Donovan and formally apologized on behalf of a boardroom culture that had, in his own words, been far too comfortable mistaking polish for character. Ryder accepted the apology the way he accepted most things, with a nod and no theater, and when Ashford, clearly moved, offered to personally fund a scholarship in Ryder's name at a veterans transition program, Ryder surprised the room by declining the honor of having his name attached to it. He asked instead for something smaller, and to him far more important, that Sinclair Dynamics quietly fund transitional employment placements for veterans leaving the service with no fanfare required, no press release, no plaques, just steady work and fair wages for men and women who, like him, had learned to disappear into ordinary jobs rather than ask anyone for recognition they didn't think they deserved. Victoria, sitting at the head of the table, watched him turn down a spotlight for the second time in 2 months, and understood, with total clarity, that this was who he actually was. Not a story that had happened to be discovered, but a man who had simply never wanted to be seen in the first place, and who valued being useful over being thanked. Before the meeting ended, Ashford asked one more thing in front of the room, whether Sinclair Dynamics might issue a public correction to the record. Not just an apology behind closed doors, but a formal acknowledgement, distributed to every outlet that had covered the gala, naming exactly what Ryder had done overseas, and exactly what he'd been reduced to that night, in front of 800 people. Victoria agreed without hesitation, and the statement went out within the hour, carrying no spin, no attempt to soften her own failure. Simply the plain truth of who Ryder Donovan was and what he had been owed from the start, respect, not a spectacle. Reporters who had spent weeks treating the story as scandal now treated it, almost overnight, as something closer to a parable, and for once Ryder didn't mind the attention, because it wasn't about him anymore. It was about every man and woman like him, overlooked in 100 rooms they'd never been invited to prove themselves in. Noah's treatment by then had reached its final stage, the tremor in his small hand nearly gone, his neurologist cautiously optimistic that the last procedure would complete what the earlier ones had started. Victoria had been there for 2 of the 4 sessions, not as Sinclair Dynamics' CEO, but simply as someone who had, somewhere in the 6 weeks since that hospital corridor conversation with Dominic, become a quiet fixture in Noah's recovery, bringing him a stuffed fox he'd named Rocket, learning without being told that he liked his sandwiches cut in triangles, never once making her presence about anything other than showing up. What began between her and Ryder had never been declared or announced. It had simply accumulated, evening by evening, in waiting rooms and quiet kitchens, in the particular ease of 2 people who had both learned, in very different ways, not to trust softness until it had proven itself with time. Neither of them rushed toward the word for what they'd become. They let it arrive on its own, the way Ryder let most things arrive, without ceremony, without demand, simply true once it was finally spoken aloud. The quiet coda came 4 months after that, on an unremarkable Sunday afternoon, in the small backyard of a house Ryder had finally been able to afford. Modest, ordinary, nothing like the gala's chandeliers, where Noah chased a soccer ball across grass with both hands steady at his sides, and Victoria sat on the porch steps beside Ryder, no makeup, no publicist within 100 miles, wearing an old flannel shirt that had once been his. On the small table between them sat the same crystal water glass from the night of the gala. Ryder had kept it, quietly, without ever explaining why, and it was Victoria who finally asked. He told her simply that he'd set it down carefully that night, because it wasn't his to break, because none of what was happening to him that evening had felt like it belonged to him at all. Not the humiliation, not the offer, not even the punch he'd been ready to take. He said he'd learned a long time ago that a man could survive almost anything if he just stayed steady and waited for the truth to catch up. Victoria, watching Noah laugh somewhere out on the grass, said quietly that the truth had taken its time catching up to her, and that she was grateful, every day now, that it finally had. If you've ever been the person in the worn jacket, standing at the edge of a room that decided who you were before you said a single word, this story is for you. Worth was never something other people got to hand out in front of a crowd. It was something you carried the whole time, whether or not anyone bothered to notice. Somewhere right now there's a quiet man setting down a glass carefully, a steady woman learning to see past what's easy to judge, and a truth still making its way to the surface. Stay close. The final truth is always worth the wait.